The 569th edition of the Four Corners podcast starts right now.
This is the Four Corners podcast.
And that could make a difference. Lawson at the buzzer. Good! Maybe not. Ty Lawson wins it at the buzzer.
Deep three. And Green rips down the rebound in traffic. 4-on-1.
What a great job. What a terrific job in transition. I mean, you couldn't plan that any better as a coach.
Gets the roll. Here we go. Page has it. Carolina down one. 84-83. Page into the front court with 4 seconds. Page to the rim. Got it! He got it! 9/10 of a second to go. Inbounds. Washington gets it to Warren. His full court shot. No good. Marcus Page baby. Does it for the Tar Heels. Carolina wins it.
Don't force it if you're Goss.
Comes in. Blocked by Meeks. Buried up ahead to Jackson. And he tucks it down for the 5-point lead. Matthews off the mark. And this year the confetti is going to fall for North Carolina. They're not going to be denied this time. Inside 30 overall. Love, top of the key. Oh! Big time delivery.
Here are your hosts, Josh Marlowe and Anthony Pagnotta.
Hello and welcome in to another live edition of the Four Corners podcast. We are powered by Carolina Electrical Services. Josh and Anthony here with you on a Thursday night, finally starting our What If series, something that we kind of promoted that we were going to start doing back in June, but due to the schedule with recruiting, the NBA draft and such, we've pushed it off to now. Here we are in about a third of the way through July, but we'll be doing this throughout the remainder of the off season. And Thursday nights is going to be our recording night for this episode. So hopefully you can put us on your calendar for the next 5-6 weeks or so. We'll be here every Thursday talking about the biggest what ifs in Carolina basketball history. We start tonight with the 1950s, and we'll get to that in just a moment. We start every edition of the pod, as we always do, with the pod thought of the day. We go to John McGinn for today's pod thought, and I was trying to find something around what if to kind of set the tone for the series that's going to take place over the next month or so. And his pod thought is, quote, "You cannot look back and think what if." So sad to tell you, John, that's exactly what we're about to do over the next handful of weeks.
We're going to spit right in your face and do exactly that. So
because there was a lot of what ifs that I thought about just on the surface, where I was like, well, you come up with one, I come up with one. We'll spend 25, 30 minutes talking about it. But there's just too much meat on the bone when you look at this program for us to just do one. And so like tonight I think it's 4 what if scenarios that we're going to go over. And some decades will differ. But I am really excited because I think, one, for maybe our younger audience, this will be a good history lesson. And maybe they learn some background information about the program that they did not know. Some of the stuff is still just we look at one thing we'll talk about tonight is coming full circle with Carolina leaving the Southern Conference in the 1950s to join the ACC, when we feel like we're kind of on the back nine of our time in that conference and going to join either the SEC or the Big Ten in the foreseeable future. So I think it's going to be a lot of fun. Hopefully you guys enjoy it. Put a lot of time, a lot of thought, and even some research into kind of doing this. And I'm really excited to see how this thing will go throughout the remainder of the offseason. So let's go ahead and jump right into it. Let's not waste any more time. We're starting off with the 1950s, and that's really because when I think Carolina basketball came into focus in terms of being a national program. Yes, they got a national title that was awarded to them in 1924. That was a retroactive championship. They got awarded that in 1939. by the Helms Foundation. And yes, they played for the NCAA tournament title in the 1940s, but even then, basketball was not the primary sport of focus on campus. Carolina was still a football-first school and even a baseball-first school. Basketball had not yet become what we know it is now, to where it is the lifeline of being a Carolina fan. So I wanted to start with the 1950s because that's when that happened. Carolina would arrive on the ACC and the national scene, winning conference regular season, conference tournament, and national titles that would take basketball as a sport to a different level on campus and across the state. And when you look at that, it all starts and ends with the arrival of Frank McGuire. There's no denying that Dean Smith, the godfather of Carolina basketball, is the one that established Carolina as a perennial national contender year in, year out, arguably what we believe it to be now as the best program in college basketball. But none of this, I don't think, happens without Frank McGuire coming here. He comes to Carolina. He arrives in the early 1950s. In 1952, he left his alma mater, St. John's, to come to the South and coach Carolina. And it's a sad story than what brought him here, but it was because his son, who was sick with cerebral palsy, he needed to have the best hospitals, the best doctors around to help take care of his sons. And that existed with Carolina and Duke being located so close to one another. And that's kind of what drove him to leave his alma mater the year after taking them to their first and only Final Four. He arrives at UNC, and over his time at Carolina would go 164-58, including 99-31 in the ACC, with 5 first-place finishes, 2 ACC tournament titles, and that national championship in 1957. For his time, a larger-than-life figure. This was a guy that spent money on clothes and dressed very eloquently for a man of his time. To be coaching basketball, was considered the best dressed man coach in the business. He kind of set the tone for something Coach Smith would carry out whenever Carolina would travel. They were always dressed in coats and ties or blazers. They stayed in 5-star hotels. They dined at the best of restaurants. And so the first what if for me, it has to start with Frank McGuire's arrival, because he was the first one to make basketball a focus, I think, on campus. His lifestyle on and off the court made him a larger-than-life figure. And then, of course, with the success that he brought on the basketball court, there was no denying that with him on the sidelines, Carolina was going to become a basketball school, and one that was going to be one of the teams to beat in the ACC on a year-in, year-out basis.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if it's as strong to say that Carolina would not have been a basketball school, but I do think that what would have eventually happened is that Carolina would have found their way. They would have found their guy, but we have no idea what would have happened right here. We do not have, social media back then, so we don't even have really newspapers reporting on it. So you don't know who would have been the next hire for Carolina, who was next on Carolina's list. We don't even know if Frank McGuire was number 1 on the list. We have no idea, but he ends up being the hire, and that really sets the precedent for everything that Carolina does, starting in the 1950s and then going on. You mentioned, about how well dressed the guys were and everything like that. That was a tradition that Carolina carried on for a long time. And, in terms of being big enough to where you were acting like you were one of the best programs in the country, that was something that Carolina needed at the time. They needed that boost to show that, yeah, look, we are a football school. We're a school that is prioritizing that. But at the time, I mean, that was something I would say just about every school was prioritizing. Every school but the Northeast schools. Some of the Northeast schools were probably starting to prioritize basketball, but Carolina was really one of the first Southern schools to prioritize basketball. And that needs to be credited to Frank McGuire for coming in here and changing that culture and saying that, look, Football is still important. Of course, we know to this day that is the revenue sport that generates the most money. But at the same time, basketball can be what carries this university here. And I think that's you have to wonder, if he doesn't get hired, is that actually the case? Because who knows if Dean Smith ever finds his way to Chapel Hill.
Yeah, I mean, that's why maybe it's too far to say, does Carolina become a basketball school? But I do think like it is his hire and his role plays such an important factor into what Carolina would become. Because as we'll talk about here in just a minute, he brought Coach Smith to Chapel Hill, who, of course, would succeed him after he resigned in 1961. But he just changed the mindset and the way of thinking. Because it's kind of hard to fathom. Like back then, Carolina wasn't selling out their gymnasium. They weren't filling out a Woolen Gym like, the way that they would do later in that decade, or, like you saw in the Carmichael Arena days, or now what you see when they play in the Smith Center. And so he really just changed the mindset and the way of thinking, because, in the late 1940s, Carolina was on the cusp of becoming a power in football. They went to back-to-back, prestige bowl games. You had Charlie Choo-Choo Justice being a runner-up for the Heisman Trophy. And so football was, still the way of life in a way that we kind of crave for it to be now. And hopefully Bill Belichick can turn that thing around and make football as big as it's ever been. But it was the third sport on campus when he arrived. And by the time that he resigned or left, even though Coach Smith wasn't tasked with having to win at the level that he would go on to win at, basketball had certainly become a pretty big deal in this state. And that takes us to our second what if, and that's it's conference realignment for that time. But in the 1950s, that's when Carolina joined the ACC. They left the Southern Conference. They were a charter member of the ACC, which was a 7-team league at its beginning, would grow into 8, would grow into 9. And, of course, now we see it now as a 17-team league that stretches all the way to the West Coast. But the Carolina left the Southern Conference, which is different from the SEC, but it was at one point a 32-team conference. It was a super conference. It was a power conference, kind of where we're trending towards now with the SEC and the Big Ten. But these types of conferences existed way back when. And so Carolina left the Southern Conference for the ACC. And really behind the influence of NC State's Everett Case, who left the state of Indiana to co-lead the Wolfpack program, the ACC would emerge as the premier basketball conference in the 1950s. And a lot of the traditions that you see today, the cutting down of the net, that was a tradition started by Everett Case while he was at NC State. But it kind of all culminated with Carolina winning the national championship in 1957 that took the sport to a whole new level, both in the state of North Carolina with State, Carolina, Duke, and Wake Forest, all ACC members, and then really throughout the South. And it would set the league up to really become the best conference in college basketball. You look at what happened in the 1960s, where Duke was going to Final Fours, a perennial top 10 team year in, year out. Wake Forest became a top 10 program. Carolina, the back end of that decade, would emerge as a top 10 program, 3 straight Final Fours. And the 1970s, Maryland, NC State playing maybe the greatest game of all time. Those teams playing for conference and national championships, and so on and so forth. And now we sit here today and we talk a lot about how maybe Carolina needs to look to get out of the ACC and go join the SEC or the Big Ten because of the financial benefit of playing in those conferences. But so much history, so much tradition is tied up to Carolina in the Atlantic Coast Conference, which makes you wonder, what if they would have never joined the ACC and stayed in the super conference that was the Southern Conference back there in the 1950s?
Well, I think then what ends up happening is they go to the SEC, and what more than likely ends up happening is that Carolina's biggest rival more than likely would be NC State. I would imagine that NC State would have stuck with them. But I'm going to tell you that Kentucky would have been a huge rivalry for Carolina because that would have been the primary team in the SEC. I don't think that was changing unless you want to go and start messing with some of the stuff that happens with the Kentucky program as well. Since we're not doing that, I mean, look, Kentucky would have become a powerhouse. Carolina would have been a powerhouse right alongside of it. And all of a sudden you would have had your rivalry right there in the Southeast Conference. And so, I mean, Carolina, you also wonder at that point, if Carolina's in the Southeast Conference, I mean, does football become the focus at the university? Even with the success that basketball has had, does football become the focus, or do they stick along a similar path to what we've seen with Kentucky, where football matters? Football certainly has its place, and Kentucky has had its success in football, but basketball is really ultimately what takes the cake. And I think if, with the hire of Frank McGuire, if he ends up staying, if we end up keeping that the way that it was, and then same thing with the Dean Smith hire, then yeah, Carolina becomes a basketball power. There's a good chance that they end up probably saying, hey, look, football's important, but hey, we're really good at basketball. We're one of the best. I think the most interesting point is I don't see any way that Duke would have fit in the SEC, though. And so I don't know if that rivalry really becomes what it becomes. It might be what Carolina-Kentucky is. It might be maybe a little bit more than that, probably a yearly rivalry that they play once a year, maybe more like Louisville-Kentucky. But I think you have that debate of which one of these matchups really is the greatest rivalry in basketball, where right now, because of the way that it was, what happened with the ACC, that easily became not only the greatest rivalry in college basketball, that became the greatest rivalry in all of sports.
Yeah, I think that's the best point, is that if this never happens, if Carolina never joins the ACC and they stay behind in the Southern Conference, and I like you think they would eventually ended up in the SEC, then we don't have the greatest rivalry in sports. But maybe we think of it differently, because maybe Carolina, Kentucky, which is a rivalry, and you will be reminded of that this year when we go to Rupp Arena, and you feel how different that game is when it's played on campus as opposed to a neutral court the week before Christmas. Maybe that still becomes the premier rivalry in college basketball. But it still wouldn't be the same, because of what makes Carolina Duke so unique and so special is you've got two schools separated by 8 miles that compete for conference championships, compete for national championships, and have, perennially done it in different ways. 2 different ways of thought, 2 different ways of actions, but they both resulted in a ton of success. So that was the first thing I thought of as well, was if they go to the SEC, Duke's not there, then we don't have the rivalry that we love, that we cherish so much. Because, if there's one thing you can criticize the people when they founded the ACC, because we know this now, when you see conferences get built and get put together, you're not taking 4 teams from one state and putting them in a conference, let alone 2 teams that are separated by 8 miles. It's very rare that they're going to be in the same conference in a big conference. When you get into the small Division I college basketball programs, that kind of stuff does happen. But when you're talking about, what you see today with the SEC, the Big 10, the Big 12, and the ACC, it's only because that's the way it's been for so long. When you're building conferences from the ground up, you're taking 1, maybe 2 teams per state, because you're trying to be in as many TV markets as possible. So what's really, I think, unique is that this could all come full circle, where Carolina could find itself in the SEC by the end of the decade, and Duke might not be there with them. And something we've talked about a lot when we talked about conference realignment is we know that Carolina is this valued entity, because that interlocking blue NC just carries so much value financially. But, kind of at what expense, at what cost. One thing I've always pushed back on is, well, if Carolina leaves, and they leave especially for the SEC, Duke's not going with them. what happens to the greatest rivalry in sports. And I think it's kind of just ironic that had this, we're having the same conversation now, and that same conversation could have happened all the way back in 1953 at Carolina and Duke not joined the ACC at the same time.
Well, the question, so if this is led by NC State in the ACC, so does NC State not even go with Carolina? At that rate, I mean, you're talking about Carolina in a conference where, yeah, their biggest rival is a rival that is hundreds of miles away from them in Kentucky. And it still works. And I think it would have been because they were two of the greatest programs of all time. Adolph Rupp was one of the worst human beings maybe of all time, and that probably would have materialized into something. You'd imagine that was someone that Carolina fans would have taken to hating very easily, as well as a lot of their other coaches and players at the time. So, I mean, look, I think that would be the most interesting element of all of this is what would have happened to the rivalries for Carolina. Where do they develop? In football, if you play a team once, it is what it is. Like, you could still play NC State. They probably would have still played NC State, and maybe they would have played Duke every year. Even if not, you could still consider those rivalries whenever you play them. But in basketball, you've got to play pretty much every year for it to be considered a rivalry. Carolina, I mean, they haven't played Kentucky every year. That's still a rivalry. But at the same time, I mean, they play nearly every year. So it would have been interesting to see, would Carolina have been aggressive in scheduling those out-of-conference matchups with State, with Duke? I find it hard to believe. I think if Carolina would have said that they were staying, I think NC State would have reversed path and said, look, we're staying too, because I think NC State pretty much went as Carolina went. That was their rival. They wanted to hang on to Carolina as a rival. They wanted to follow in their footsteps, especially because they knew Carolina was probably the bigger brand. At least they grew into the bigger brand. But I think those two were probably always going to be coupled together. And so I think NC State probably follows them to the SEC. I think NC State becomes their biggest rival. And we've talked about it. The most top, the most top 25 matchups, or is
top
it
10?
Top 10? Most top 10 matchups, it's Duke, Carolina. Right behind it, it's Carolina, NC State. So you'd imagine that becomes the greatest rivalry in all of college basketball. Who knows what the NC State program actually looks like? Maybe they take more of a mold of what Duke actually ended up becoming. And who knows, maybe that really results in a rivalry that we're sitting here talking about each and every year as the greatest rivalry in all of sports. That would have been something that would have been interesting to see how that would have played out.
Yeah, because it's where we're seeing it. We're seeing it now with the injection of confidence. And I mean, at this point, it's arrogance from Will Wade and NC State, where we haven't even played a game yet. And I mean, I can't speak for all Carolina fans. I'm fed up with the guy, especially after the stunt he pulled in his latest press conference that somehow got praised on the airwaves that you and I work on. You let Hubert Davis do something like that, he would have been criticized. One thing I've always loved when I talk about the history of the ACC on the basketball side, because it means so much to me. And it's something that I literally laugh at and scoff at. NC State went and hired Everett Case, and they prioritized basketball because they couldn't beat Carolina and Duke in football, couldn't beat Carolina and Duke in baseball. So they said, you know what? We're going to go become a basketball school. And for the very short, the beginning of the ACC, they were the cream of the crop. They were the best team in the league, led by Everett Case. But by the end of the decade, they'd been surpassed by the school they hated the most, who not only won an ACC title, but won a national championship. And while it was Everett Case that wanted to make ACC basketball this entity, and he gets a lot of credit for it, it was Carolina that took it to a whole different level, which just makes me smile so much that they tried to find a way to one-up us in another sport. And in less than a decade, we'd already one-up them and really set the tone for basketball becoming the heartbeat of this state from a from a fandom perspective. Like as we see it now, we look at North Carolina, we got the Panthers, you got the Hornets, you've got Charlotte FC, we've got pro teams, you got the Carolina Hurricanes. I still think at its core, and I think you saw it this past year with the ACC tournament turnout in Charlotte, and what happens when you've got a local team like a Carolina or a Duke that's a national contender. This state still loves its college basketball, and that you have to give credit to NC State, but you really got to tip your tap to Carolina and that 1957 team that really started it all. And I think when people talk about that national championship team, well, they went 32-0, and that's a fantastic achievement. I don't know if a lot of people understand that they went 32-0 in a day and time where once they got to the conference tournament, they had to win their conference tournament to play for the NCAA tournament. There was no such thing as an at-large bid. You won your way into the NCAA tournament, and you went on your way from there. And Carolina almost got beat in the semifinal round of that tournament. They were able to escape. I believe it was Wake Forest. They were able to go on and beat by 2, but then they get into the NCAA tournament. They advance to what we would later be known as the Final Four, which was played on back-to-back nights back then. And they beat Michigan State and Kansas on back-to-back nights in triple overtime. You're talking about an all-time feat that quite literally will never be duplicated again in the history of college basketball. But that's what Lenny Rosenbluth and that squad was able to do. And that's what really set the table for college basketball becoming the thing that it became in the sport or in the state, and then for what it became on campus. Like Carolina returned back from Kansas City. They were greeted by a bunch of people, something they were not even expecting. There was the TV broadcast. They chiseled out some blocking in the arena to get a TV broadcast back here in North Carolina, so many people could tune in and watch the undefeated Tar Heels take down Wilt Chamberlain and the Kansas Jayhawks. And really from that point on, we have not looked back as a state, and Carolina as a program has not looked back ever since. It's their second, national title overall, their first NCAA title as a program, and kind of just makes you wonder that if that team loses in the ACC tournament and they don't make the NCAA tournament, or let's just say they lose to Michigan State or they lose to Kansas in the Final Four, does college basketball become what it becomes across the state of North Carolina? And does it become the king on campus? Because that to me is the turning point. When you look at 1957 and Carolina winning the national championship, I think that's when the university kind of turned its attention and its focus to saying, hey, this is the sport we can be great at, we can compete at annually, and quite literally haven't looked back ever since.
Yeah, that's probably the turning point. I would agree with you there that's the moment where Carolina realized, hey, basketball needs to be the focus on campus here because we've got something special. And they should have realized that. You're talking about a feat that only 7 teams have ever accomplished in the history of the NCAA tournament. There are teams that did go undefeated. Carolina, the championship that they were awarded, back in 1924, yeah, that team was undefeated. But the thing is that since this point, when Carolina ends up doing this, I mean, yeah, you had the UCLA teams where there were 4 different teams that went undefeated. I mean, what an unbelievable run there for John Wooden and his boys during that time. But then it's Indiana in 1975-76 when they went 32-0. That's the last team to ever do it. And I find it hard to believe you will ever see a team that will go undefeated ever again. But the thing is that you talked about what was so different about this run and what I think made it really stand out. And maybe what really made it stand out on campus too was that Carolina not only had to win these games. They not only had to win their conference championship just to get into the tournament, they then had to go into the tournament and win back-to-back triple overtime games against Michigan State and Kansas State. I mean, you're talking, and Kansas, excuse me. You're talking about one of the craziest ways to win a national championship that you could ever think of. You could not write a better story than the one that Carolina basketball painted for you in 1957. And to do it with a player like Lenny Rosenbluth. I mean, dude, you go back to the first question that we had here in this What If series. What if Frank McGuire never comes to Carolina? Well, Lenny Rosenbluth never commits here. Lenny stays in New York. Lenny plays for St. John's, and Lenny probably leads them to a national championship. And Carolina does not become what they are. So these two, I think, tie very hand in hand with each other. But I mean, the thing is even if you change just what happened in 1957, let's say Carolina gets beat in that national championship game against Kansas. Well, then, I mean, who knows what Carolina's program ends up becoming? Maybe the football program stays the focus on campus. Even if it doesn't, who knows what Frank McGuire is able to do? Because remember, Frank McGuire does not really last that much longer at Carolina before the NCAA has to come down on him. And so if he doesn't end up getting a national championship, what ends up happening? I would think that he still ends up hiring Dean Smith as his assistant. Dean, the thing is does Dean, with all the pressure, not only, he had the pressure of trying to get the program's second national championship and his first national championship, and we saw how long it took. How much would there be? How much more pressure would be there if Carolina, this great basketball program who is putting together all these great seasons, but it's not resulting in NCAA titles? How much more pressure is there on him in 1982 when he then goes into that national championship game and is looking for the program's first national championship? I think all of those things are very interesting, and it's what makes this question, more than just about any of the ones that we have on this list, probably the most interesting.
Yeah, I think, it was kind of a sub-story to what you talked about with Frank McGuire and Lenny Rosenbluth. Like back then, most of the time you did not recruit outside of the regional area that your school was located in. And it was mainly because of financial resources. There wasn't the money that was afforded for coaches to travel and recruit the way that you see, coaches travel now, where they're flying on private jets, they're showing up in helicopters and whatnot. But when you look at that entire Carolina basketball roster, the heartbeat of it, the foundation of it, was built by a bunch of New Yorkers, as you mentioned. Lenny Rosenbluth, he hailed from the Bronx. Joe Quigg from Brooklyn. Tommy Kearns, he was from, New Jersey. Pete Brennan was also from Brooklyn. Just a pipeline of players from that area that connected with Frank McGuire on and off the court. Mm-hmm. And it's kind of an odd scene. And if you ever go back and listen to Jones Angel and Adam Lucas did a sit-down interview with 4 of the 5 starters from that 1957 squad a few years ago. You can find it on the Carolina Insider podcast feed. And they talked about how they were a bunch of Catholic boys that were, living in the Baptist South, and just how different, the culture was and the way of life and the customs. But that's what, that was only made possible because what did Carolina hire as its head coach? A Catholic Irishman who could relate to them. And so, I think that's another thing you look at there, is just the fact that his connection to that area, he had a scout that would scout these players, report back, report to him. And then, between him and his assistant, Buck Freeman, they would make the trips up there to kind of recruit these guys. But it was kind of uncommon back then. Whereas now you see Carolina, definitely wants to recruit in state, but is a national recruiting power and now is dipping its toes into the international waters. That wasn't even a thought back then. You basically recruited your area. Maybe you went into like one different time zone, depending on if you went into the Midwest. But it was very rare you saw a school in the South recruiting up in the North. And so I think that's another byproduct of it is if you don't hire Frank McGuire, you don't get Lenny Rosenbluth, to campus. And he's a top 10 Carolina basketball player of all time. I know there's not a lot of footage of him, but when you look at what he did, what he accomplished, and the pressure he was under in his senior year to make sure he, played at that level because if Carolina lost, they could not go to the NCAA tournament, to me is just fascinating because I think you are right. They're one of the only 7 undefeated teams in NCAA tournament history. And the way that theirs kind of came together and culminated, you could argue is more impressive than the last team to go undefeated in Indiana. And maybe not as good, maybe not as dominant as what those UCLA teams did during their run of 10 titles in 12 years. But you're not going to find a team that won back-to-back triple overtime games to win a national championship. Like a lot of people look at, Virginia's run in 2019, where they trailed in the final 10 seconds of their Elite Eight game, their Final Four game, and their national title game, and yet they went on to win the national championship as improbable, and rightfully so. But I would make the argument that winning back-to-back triple overtime games was even more improbable. And then the fact you did it against Wilt Chamberlain, who was a giant for his time. Carolina sent out a 5'7" guard to jump ball against him because they knew they had no chance at winning the jump ball. It was just a joke that Frank McGuire pulled. But like to beat Wilt Chamberlain in Kansas City, talk about a de facto in their backyard Final Four as well. It stinks that because of just the time frame, there wasn't the media coverage that there is now, because this is a story that there's still so much life to be told, because it's honestly one of the more impressive national champions we have in college basketball that not even many college basketball diehard fans know all that a lot about.
Yeah, I mean, that's what's sad about it is you talk about all the great players that were on that roster. But, I mean, to take down Wilt Chamberlain in the fashion that they did. And, I mean, yeah, there's so many stories that have come out from that group. I mean, that's definitely one that, unfortunately, we haven't heard every story about. And most of those guys are older or have passed on, so you won't hear just every story about. I mean, it's to be honest with you, we talk about how impressive some of the national championships are that we saw under Roy Williams, especially that 2005 title that he was, able to win so quickly after taking over the program. But I mean, I think that 1956-57 squad is probably the best overall squad story that we have in Carolina basketball history, because there were so many obstacles that could have gotten in their way. It was easy for it to fall short like it had in previous seasons. And I mean, you look at, some of the previous seasons under Frank McGuire, I mean, that was easily the most success that Frank McGuire had. I mean, prior to that, he had just one season, the previous season, where his team did not lose double-digit games. So, I mean, in his time there, Carolina was good. They had moments where they were good, but they did not have these moments like they had that year, where everything just came together. And you talked about, the guys that they got from up north that were down here in an environment that they were not used to and became heroes, especially a guy like Lenny Rosenbluth. I mean, we've debated with a lot of different people that don't really respect the history of Carolina basketball, that or not, maybe it's not that they don't that they don't respect it, but it's more of the fact that they want to look more recent, and they're focused on what's happened more recently. When, I mean, dude, you look at Lenny, he is one of the top 5 all-time players at Carolina. I think he's top 3 just based off of the stats, winning a national championship, and how impactful he was for the future of this program. So, I mean, for him to be that impactful, and for this group to be to find a way through as many improbable situations as they did, That's what makes them truly one of the more special teams that Carolina has ever had, and that the sport of college basketball has ever had.
Yeah, I think if we were ever to do a list of most underrated national championship teams, I think this 1957 team would have to be at the top of the list. Adam Lucas wrote a book about it, The Greatest Game Ever Played, and there's a lot in there. I've read it. It's a great read. If you want to learn more about that team, that season, that Final Four, I do encourage you to check out that book because there's only Adam Lucas could tell that story the way that he told it, and you really kind of get a firsthand look at just what all that team went through on their way to winning the school's first NCAA tournament title. We now get to our last what if, our last scenario if this doesn't happen, there's no doubt that it changes the course of Carolina basketball history. And that's what if Frank McGuire does not hire Dean Smith. We have a saying that, you can't have a Roy Williams without a Dean Smith, but you can't have a Dean Smith without Frank McGuire. And who knows, because of where Coach Smith went to school, if you don't know, he was a reserve at Kansas, played for Fog Allen. Maybe he was destined to still become a great coach. He was the son of a coach. Maybe Coach Smith still becomes Coach Smith somewhere else. But, he gets brought to Carolina in 1957, 1958. Frank McGuire hires him away from the Air Force Academy where he was serving as an assistant coach. And he would be on the bench for 3 years before ultimately becoming Carolina's head coach in 1961 when Frank McGuire leaves, basically forced to resign because he had embarrassed the university because the NCAA had shown up on campus for spending too much at meals on recruiting visits. That was kind of a thing back then where you could only spend so much at a recruiting dinner. He did not care. And the thing that he spent a lot of his money on was dressing for salad. That's just kind of the character that Frank McGuire was. But, it did pave the way for, Coach Smith to be a 31-year-old head coach and kind of grow on the job. But, I don't know how you rank these what ifs 1 through 4. I did this in chronological order. This one you could make the argument as the most consequential because yes, Frank McGuire brought big time basketball to Carolina, won a national championship. Dean Smith would be the guy that would establish Carolina at the back end of the 1960s as a national power, as what I believe, and I think you believe as well, as the best program in the sport, has definitely established the greatest sports fraternity that we have, which is the Carolina basketball family. And so when you look at this, there's just no doubt that the course of this program would look so much different today if he does not hire this assistant from the Air Force Academy and Dean Smith.
Yeah, I mean, we really have absolutely no idea what direction Carolina goes in if this doesn't end up happening. If he ends up saying, you know what, we're good, we're going to find somebody else to serve on the staff, the people would think, well, who would be the next assistant that would have taken the job? Well, the only one that most people know outside of Dean Smith is Buck Freeman. Buck Freeman was not staying there. Buck Freeman was the right-hand man to Frank McGuire. He was not going to stay on and coach. He eventually went on to coach with Frank at South Carolina. So at that point, it's not anybody that's on staff. You would imagine that because Carolina had won a national championship, they probably end up getting somebody that's decent. They get some coach that is probably fairly well known, maybe someone that, would have been able to become a program legend as well, but you just don't know what happens. This is the thing about this one, is that it's as consequential, but I don't think it's as damning as if they don't win the national championship in 57. Because I think if you make the right hire, you still could end up being a great basketball program. And I think that Carolina had taken that step by winning that national championship of becoming a great basketball program. It was just about then finding the right guy. Ultimately, we know this was the perfect marriage because who knows what happens to Dean Smith too. Now he may become the head coach of Kansas. Maybe that's what ends up happening. And he may still become one of the greatest of all time, but he's Kansas's guy. And that means Roy Williams is a Kansas guy. There's, maybe he ends up coaching at Carolina at some point, but he wouldn't have had nearly the affinity for Carolina that he would have if Dean Smith had hired him to a Kansas staff, and that was where his program ties were to. There's so many different things that can really extend off of this. But I do think it would have been interesting to wonder just exactly who they bring in 1961, who takes over as the head coach. And is that somebody that then carries a different legacy, but ultimately the one that becomes the Carolina family that we're talking about today? It's just run a little bit differently.
Yeah, the name that sticks out to me the most is Horace Bones McKinney, a guy who played at Carolina in the 1940s. Would become the Wake Forest head coach, and would actually kind of grow to actually hate his alma mater. But like that's probably the only name that sticks out that like you could even think about, just considering the fact that they would have probably wanted to hire someone with ties to the university. Because when Dean Smith got hired, the one thing he was told by the Chancellor Aycock was to run a clean program and don't embarrass us. Because, back then, when the NCAA showed up, it wasn't like it is now. Like when the NCAA shows up, they don't really have a whole lot of power. Back then, the NCAA had all the power. And so, when you talk about that 7-year cloud we went through 2010 through 2017 when they were on campus, this was even worse. And for that time and just the burden that school felt and how embarrassed they were from winning a national championship to, you have a point shaving scandal where a Carolina player gets involved. You have the recruiting thing as well, where you're spending too much money on recruiting dinners, on salad dressings and the like. And so I do think you are right with the fact that Carolina was less than 5 years removed from winning a national championship. The job would have been interesting and intriguing if they wanted to go on a quote unquote national search. For that time, the ACC was becoming a basketball conference with a high reputation, back then people raved about the lifestyle, the way of life of how living in the South was, just in terms of from a financial standpoint. And all that as well. So I do think Carolina would have been positioned to get a coach that could have kept the program on the national scene. It just wouldn't be Coach Smith. And it's, when we talk about this program, like, yes, we grew up with Roy Williams. That's our guy. But I could not imagine a world talking about Carolina basketball and now talking about Coach Smith. And so maybe you're right where it's not the most damning, but I do think from a connection standpoint, this maybe is the biggest one because in some way or another, we have a connection to him despite one, we've never met him. Of course, unfortunately he's passed on, but there's still a connection to him because he's the godfather of a program that we all love so much. And so, I definitely think if you were to try to rank these what ifs 1 through 4, that one's got to be very high at the list. Is there anything that maybe you could think of from the 1950s that we're leaving off in terms of a what if scenario? Because we'll go back through it in case you're joining us here live on Facebook, YouTube, or on Twitter. We started the what if series, the biggest what ifs in Carolina basketball for the 1950s. I went in chronological order. 1952, what if Frank McGuire never leaves St. John's for Carolina? 1953, 1954, what if Carolina never leaves the Southern Conference for the ACC? 1957, what if the 1956-57 national title team never happens? And then 57-58, what if Frank McGuire doesn't hire Dean Smith? Before we get out of here, is there anything left that maybe you want to address from tonight's first edition of the What If series?
Well, the only other thing that you would look at is let's go to 1958-59, and let's say that Carolina, who at one time during that season was the #1 overall team in the country, what happens if they win a second NCAA tournament title there? Now they lose in the NCAA tournament first round to the Navy midshipmen at the time. That was a group that was led by York Larice, Doug Moe, and Lee Schaefer. Those are all guys who would eventually go on to play in the NBA. So very talented group as well there, just like the group in 1956-57. But unfortunately, they fall short. But let's say Carolina goes on the run there and finds a way to win a national championship. At that point, do they end up holding on to Frank McGuire? Is he a guy that they say, hey, man, this guy's won 2 national championships. He's just too good. We're going to have to end up sticking it out with him, because even though he's been through all this stuff with the NCAA, this is still a guy that's won 2 titles for us. You wonder how that would change the course of Carolina history too, because then does Dean Smith end up, staying on with him? You could even say, what if he doesn't end up, Frank McGuire, that is, doesn't end up committing some of the recruiting violations and some of the other stuff that goes on that eventually leads to his firing? And what happens if it takes longer for Dean Smith to potentially become the guy? Does Dean wait that out, or does Dean get an offer for another job that he ends up taking and leaves Carolina as well? So I think there's another path there. We talked about him not getting hired, but what if he doesn't get the job in 1961? What ends up happening there? Does he choose to wait it out, or does he find another school? And eventually Carolina has to go in a different direction for their head coach as well.
Yeah, I think if we're being honest, candid about this, if Carolina wins a second national championship in 3 seasons, and the NCAA still shows up and they still decide to move on, I find it hard to believe they turn it over to for what all intents and purposes was a no-name assistant who was 30 years old. Like, I think at that rate, they're probably conducting a national search, because there were going to be people with basketball becoming more and more popular, not just in the South, but across the country. Like, you could have maybe got a coach of equal status of a Frank McGuire, to where you just continue on becoming, being the program that you were in the 1950s and on into the 1960s, which, one would obviously back up the hire, delay the hiring process of Dean Smith, but also, I mean, we're also being kind of open about this. Probably UCLA doesn't become what UCLA is, where they win 10 titles in 12 years, because Carolina, would have been an established national power, getting the best recruiting prospects in the country, whether from the South, from the North, or from the Midwest. So I do think that's probably the one intangible was if they get a second championship. Just how does that impact the rest of what happens once the NCAA shows up? How does that impact the search? I find it hard to believe, just from what I've read about that situation. I don't think Frank McGuire would have still stayed. I think they would have, forced resigned him. He went on to the NBA before landing at South Carolina, where he would have a successful run there with the Gamecocks. But I find it hard to believe that they turn the program over to Coach Smith if they have a second national championship, because it would honestly be irresponsible. Like, you've now got a 2-time national championship winning program within 3 years. You need to go hire a coach that could keep the program at that apex. And while Coach Smith would prove to become that guy, that would not have maybe been the right hire for that time period. So I think that's one that, if Carolina gets a second national championship, there's no doubt that changes the 1960s, but maybe even just the complete and total outlook because I do think at that rate you're bringing in yet another big-time coach to keep you nationally relevant.
Yeah, I mean, it certainly is possible. And, look, here's the thing. In terms of looking up the best college coaches of the 1950s, I mean, that's tough. There's a lot of guys that you could have gone with. I mean, there were, one of the guys that was most highly regarded during that time was a guy that was originally at Bradley, then eventually went on to Michigan State and Forrest Anderson. But I mean, there were, the other big names, Henry Iba, who was at Oklahoma State at the time, Nat Holman from the CCNY, which, would of course be a school that wouldn't last, was a powerhouse during the 50s, but ultimately wouldn't last. And then, of course, Adolph Rupp. You weren't hiring Adolph Rupp, but that would have been somebody that Carolina, you would imagine back in the day would have been trying to find someone that would compare similarly to him, would be able to match up with a coach that was as successful as he was early in the 1950s and, of course, before that in the 1940s. So Carolina, I mean, they would have been in a weird spot at that time. Where do they go to hire somebody? But it would have been, you're probably right, it probably would have been a bigger name. Or if it was Dean Smith, there would have been an immense amount of pressure on his shoulders to continue to build off of the success that Carolina had. And maybe he doesn't get as long of a period of time there as he did. I mean, remember, and we'll probably talk about this when we get to the 1960s, but there was a stretch where Coach Smith was not all that successful at Carolina. And a lot of people wanted Coach Smith gone. It really wasn't until that 1966-67 season where he was able to really start to get things going. Does he get that much time? I mean, again, there wasn't the demand through newspapers back in the day. There wasn't a demand even through the television media, not like today, where there's so much pressure. There are so many different outlets that talk about this kind of stuff that eventually he probably, he might end up getting fired because of how short of a period of time they give you. He may have been given a little bit longer and maybe it lasts, maybe it turns out the same way, but there's a chance that the demands would have been higher and they would have said, you know what? You're just not meeting the standard that we have here at Carolina. We got to move on. So even that change would have been something that could have affected the future of Carolina, even if it was that Dean Smith still eventually became the head coach. You would imagine that the higher ups would say, hey, there's some different demands here with a second national championship as opposed to just that one that they got back in 56, 57.
Yeah, no, I think there's no doubt. Obviously, I can't prove it. I find it hard to believe if Carolina's got 2 titles within 3 years when Dean Smith gets hired. I don't think he survives the struggles of the early 1960s, which some of it was because of the NCAA and some of the restrictions they had from scheduling and recruiting. But nonetheless, I do think there would have been maybe a change with what Vic Bubas was able to do at Duke, establishing the Blue Devils as a top 10 program, what NC State was becoming. Wake Forest would also get really good as well. And so that's what I think is going to be really fun about this exercise is that there's going to be something we look at in every single decade that if it goes different, it changes the course of the program for this player, this coach, the conference, the sport as a whole. And so, this is only the beginning. This is just the 1950s. We'll be back next week for the 1960s. And yeah, it's a pretty big decade because you start with a coach who, was unknown, unaccomplished, and ends the decade by going to 3 straight Final Fours and really establishes himself as a premier coach in the sport and the program as a premier program in the sport. And we'll come through the 1960s next week. With that, guys, it's going to wrap up this edition of the podcast. In the meantime, we will direct you to the website. That's heeltoughblog.com. It's the summer, which means, recruiting is the forefront. A lot of big stuff going on with Bill Belichick and Carolina football. Anthony's had you covered on that front. Basketball, it's a pretty big recruiting weekend as well. You got the Adidas circuit in town in Rock Hill, the Nike circuit. is going to span over the next 2 weeks. You got Peach Jam right around the corner. Hubert Davis and their staff working tirelessly in that 26 class, as well as the 27 class. Any news and notes that comes out, I'll have you covered on that. NBA Summer League officially underway. A handful of Tar Heels in action. Make sure you check out those guys and support them as they try to land with an NBA roster for the upcoming season. But we'll keep you updated on all the recruiting stuff. And before you know it, we'll be getting you ready with for the upcoming football season with position previews with ACC kickoff now officially less than 2 weeks away. As for the podcast, you guys know where to find us. Every major podcasting platform. Simply search the Four Corners Podcast and we will pop up. There, we encourage you guys to rate, review, and subscribe. That way you don't miss any editions of the show throughout the remainder of the basketball off season. As I mentioned, we'll be back next week for the 1960s What If series. Hopefully we get to hear from Hubert Davis. John Shire and Will Wade both held press conferences this week. Hopefully we can hear from Hubert with a summer update. If so, we'll have an audio edition of that podcast or of that press conference as well. But with that, that's going to wrap up this edition of the show. I do want to thank Anthony once again for hosting with me. We want to thank you guys for watching and listening. And as always, go Tar Heels.